There is no simple answer to the question of why Mannerism emerged in Italy at the end of the High Renaissance. The answer becomes even more confused when we try to explain what it consisted of and if it was or not great art. The most popular view is that it was a reaction to the orderly and idealistic values of the High Renaissance. It has also been said that it was a reflection on the events that were taking place in Europe at the time. Both views make a lot of sense, but in my opinion, when we look at those striking images and weird compositions, what we really want to know is what was in the painter's mind. What were they trying to say? Let us first see what was happening in Europe when Mannerism emerged. The corruption of the church was provoking a strong reaction on the part of the clerics, which eventually led to the Reformation. The Pope Leo X, portrayed here by Raphael, was an extravagant pope. He had the ambitious project of reconstructing the papal basilica of St. Peter in Rome. Even with the enormous corruption, there was not enough money for such a project. He asked his Christian parishioners for donations in exchange for the promise of eternal life in heaven. A document called Papal Bull was issued that guaranteed a place in heaven after death. You can see an example here. Johann Tetzel, a German Dominic monk, with the blessing of the Pope, started in 1504 the so-called traffic of indulgences. He sold papal bulls under the motto, "The soul jumps effortlessly straight to heaven as soon as the sound of the coin is heard in the coffer." A few years later, outraged by these excesses, Martin Luther, another monk, started a massive ecclesiastical reform proposing changes that he wrote in 95 articles. He also suggested to the Pope that he should build his new basilica from his own pocket. The German nobility made good use of the dispute, supported the proposal of the monk, and decided to stop paying taxes to Rome. The reaction of the Pope was a document demanding the withdrawal of 41 of Luther's articles. Failure to do so, he said, would mean being excommunicated. Luther replied by burning the Pope's papal bull in public. The following year, in 1521, he was excommunicated. Here in the United Kingdom there was also conflict. In 1535, King Henry VIII gave himself the title of Supreme Head of the Anglican Church. The Church of England no longer had to obey Rome, becoming a national independent church with the king fully in charge. It is therefore easy to imagine the Dante-esque scenery during this period in time. With the Holy Inquisition full on, torture was acceptable, and many women accused of being sorcerers and witches were burnt alive in the main squares of villages and towns. To make matters worse, there was an outbreak of plague in Italy in 1521. Thousands of people died. 6 years later, Rome was sacked by the troops of Charles V. Palaces, churches, and houses were looted, burned, and destroyed. During both the Renaissance and the Mannerist period, this was the backdrop around the studios of many European artists. However, there were also good things happening. In the middle of the 15th century, the printing press was invented in Germany. In less than half a century, hundreds of European cities had printed books. Many were able to learn to read and write. This had a big impact in the development of culture and in building the foundations of the Renaissance. North Italy was up and coming. The powerful merchants consisted of families of traders such as the Medicis. Their hunger for prestige motivated investment in art and science. From then on, not only the church and the aristocracy would commission paintings. Those who paid for the canvases wanted to see their faces on them, and portraiture flourished. To understand Mannerism, we have first to see the work of the painters that were there before the new style emerged. Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo are considered the great masters of the High Renaissance, although there were many more. Their paintings were inspired in antiquity, following the values of the Greeks and the Romans. Renaissance was based on the concept of harmony and the natural. To reflect serenity and balance was essential. The composition of the paintings followed a recognized order. Back in the 1st century AD, Vitruvius had calculated the proportions of the human body from the measure of the open hand. Leonardo's drawings shows Vitruvius' theory. The numbers indicate how many hand lengths there are in each unit. The face has the width of the extended hand. The navel is the center of the body. The genitals divide the body in half. The body has the length of 8 hands. The golden section was also used to compose a painting. It is a proportion taken from nature. The spiral of the Nautilus shell is a perfect example. It creates a golden rectangle that gives us a proportion. 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 plus 1 equals 3, 3 plus 2 equals 5, and so on. This proportion can be calculated from any given line by turning it into a perfect square. We then divide it in two. With a compass, we then draw a semicircle. The new measurement completes the golden rectangle. Alternatively, we can use the P number and simply multiply AB by the length of the line. The famous canvas of Mona Lisa, painted by Leonardo, is the clearest example of a portrait of the High Renaissance. The composition uses the devices that I have mentioned: order, balance, and serenity. The use of aerial perspective created depth. Pale blue and cloudy colors were used to imply distance. The esfumato technique, consisting in applying very thin coats of oil paint one on top of the other, would erase the contour. And this is the final result: harmony and beauty. In Tondo Done, painted by Michelangelo, we see compositional elements similar to those of Leonardo. Order, balance, and perspective are all there, yet the grandiosity of the images and the modeling of the bodies is beginning to reflect Mannerist ideas. The group of standing naked figures in the background are somehow disorderly and odd, considering that he is portraying the Holy Family. By contrast, in the School of Athens, Raphael's composition is very classical. Balance, order, and perspective again. Everything has been calculated in detail according to the rules and pictorial norms. Even the height of the sages seems to be uniform. Vanishing points were used to achieve exact perspective. More here, where the golden section is also present. Here and here. More geometry and references to Vitruvius. Furthermore, all the characters follow a hierarchy. Raphael has painted Leonardo da Vinci as Plato and Michelangelo as Hercules or Hercules. Raphael himself is also in the picture, but has no title. The values of the Renaissance are all here. The death of Raphael in 1520 is considered the key date of the peak of Mannerism. In contrast to the High Renaissance, Mannerism was totally anti-classical. Almost 500 years later, there are still many queries about this style of painting. Mannerism in Italian means alla maniera de, in the manner of. In the manner of the great masters of the High Renaissance, in other words, following the line of Michelangelo, Leonardo, or Raphael, but maintaining in principle a clear personal style. It developed in intellectual and independent circles and in the royal court. It was only apt for refined palates capable of appreciating occult meanings. It included the violation and rupture of pictorial rules and distortions of perspective and scale. It was based in emotional intensity and in total ambiguity. The compositions were often claustrophobic, the colors discordant and bright, and the images often elongated and in exaggerated postures. The Italians Pontormo, Bronzino, and Parmigianino are considered three of the major exponents of this style, and they are the artists that we will see in this talk. Their paintings often portrayed complicated allegories with obscure meanings. There was a rejection of the classical beauty of the High Renaissance, as well as an abandonment of the values of serenity and balance. Years later, the classicists of the 17th century gave a pejorative meaning to the work of the Mannerists. For them, that maniera was a cold exercise used only to imitate the great masters. They claimed that the incomprehensible formulas and unnatural images simply led to a mediocre type of painting. In the 20th century, the opinion changed. Now, many art historians consider Mannerism as an elegant style, developed intellectually and consciously, and not a reaction to the High Renaissance. Mannerism began in Rome and Florence, and then it spread further north. Its peak was during the papacy of Julius II and Leo X, both great patrons of the arts. It covered the period between 1520 and 1615, soon after the death of El Greco. Although Italy was the center, Mannerism was also developed in Spain, France, and Central Europe. The Spanish Mannerists, the French school of Fontainebleau, and the Mannerism of Central Europe are not discussed here. Before we start with our first Italian Mannerist, we will have a quick look at Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. Let's remember that between 1508 and 1512, Michelangelo was in the Vatican, in Rome, painting the vault of the famous chapel. Commissioned by the Pope, he also decorated the wall of the main altar with his fresco titled The Last Judgment, completed in 1541. The images in the fresco are contorted and twisted, and there are accentuated foreshortenings, characteristics of Mannerism. Let's now look for references. Nakedness is important. Muscled anatomies inspired in the classics. Contorted and highly modeled bodies. Humanized devils. Acid colors. Monumentality and theatrical compositions. Exaggerated movements. Great expressivity in the faces. All these people have stood in front of the highest judge, which is God. The verdict is final, and they will go to heaven or hell accordingly. Their destiny can be seen in their expression. I gather the papal bulls had not much use in here. And now let's look at our first Italian Mannerist. Joseph and Jacob in Egypt, in the National Gallery here in London, is considered a magnificent example of this style. The author is Jacopo Carucci, known as Pontormo. The Renaissance perspective no longer exists. This proportion is an important element. The two gigantic sculptures, but with tiny feet, on the podiums distort the composition. There are impossible spaces. In one same plane, we have 4 different scenes. In the bottom left-hand corner, Joseph is presenting his father to the Pharaoh. On the bottom right, Joseph, on a cart, is listening to the news from his father Jacob. Then, in the weird staircase, he is walking up with his 2 sons towards the dying Jacob. In the final scene, top right, Jacob, in his dying bed, is blessing his grandsons. I would dare to say that Mannerism was some sort of cubism of the 16th century, where everything was possible. Bright reds, greens, and blue prevail. Although there are compositional tools here, they follow a personal order. We see 2 clear compositional diagonals and several verticals. There is a chaos of bodies spread all over, with people painted big or small, disregarding conventional rules. The large house in the background could have been drawn smaller to create an illusion of distance. Instead, Pontormo uses the large size of the sculpture next to it and makes it 7 times the height of a man. The hell with vanishing points. The orderly and serene Renaissance is no more. In this fresco, very different from the biblical theme, we see 2 characters of the Roman mythology. Pomona and Vertumno. She is the goddess of vine, fruit and olive trees, gardens and allotments. The knife and the sickle were her attributes. She did not like men and hated wild nature. Vertumno, also a divinity, was god of the seasons and the fruit trees. He was madly in love with her. Camouflaged as an old woman, he went to meet Pomona to congratulate her on her beautiful gardens. Seeing that the goddess was interested in what he had to say, he then removed his costume, showing his virile beauty, and the goddess was seduced. Pontormo presents this story painting Pomona glamorously dressed in 3 different positions. Vertumno is also painted in 3 different ways: dressed, naked, and as an old man with a dog, a contorted dog with 3 legs. They are all surrounded by fruit trees and leaves. A yellow wall divides heaven from earth. The children are not part of the legend, but Pontormo uses them maybe to symbolize the fruit of love. The colors are bright and acid. Nakedness is an important element in the fresco, synonym perhaps of life. Why are the trees so violently cut, painted between the legs of the patties on top of the central window? What is Pontormo trying to say? We do not know. The position of Christ was painted for the Church of the Santa Felicità in Florence. Here we can see the emotional intensity of this artist, whom, according to Vasari, was very neurotic. The figures are much modeled and are positioned in serpentine. The colors are pale but bright. There are big contrasts. It is believed that the character pointed by the arrow is a self-portrait. The entire scene has a strong, dazzling light that lightens the figures. The space is flattened and inhospitable. All the mourning figures equally show their sorrow. There is no hierarchy. The arm of the Virgin Mary is positioned as a cross. Nicodemus, the old-rich Jew that according to the Bible converted to Christianity, is portrayed here as a young man holding the legs of Christ. His gaze draws the viewer and is an invitation to enter the tragedy. Pontormo is the mannerist of the primary and secondary colors, soft but bright, pale blues and reddish pinks, greens and orange. In the transparent and modeled way he applies them, we see the influence of Rosso Fiorentino, another great mannerist, and one of the founders of the school of Fontainebleau in France. There is no landscape, no cross, and no dramatic sky. All the tragedy is in the people around the dead Christ. The bodies invade the picture plane. There is no room for anything else. The painting is not ordered. It is human. This beautiful image of the Annunciation of the Virgin is a fresco that was painted in the wall at the right-hand side of the deposition. What is Mary thinking after listening to the angel telling her the unusual way in which she will be a mother? In here we can see 3 Renaissance virgins sharing the same experience. One by Leonardo, another by Raphael, and a third by Ghirlandaio. Acceptance, submission, and a classical pose. The lady is hollow anyway, so there is no need to express any feeling. Yet, Pontormo's Mary is alive and has personality. Her body is tilted. She holds herself casually on the wall. Her right hand is holding her cloak. She is human and she has a will. She is modern. We will leave Pontormo with this painting of Cupid and Venus completed in 1534. The erotic element, the theatrical composition, and the contorted and naked body as the main image are fully evident. Pontormo has left his vibrant colors here, but the ambiguity of his characters is still there. The monumentality of this Venus is grotesque. Her body could easily be that of a man. The phallic position of the left leg of Cupid is loaded with symbolism. The landscape could give a sensation of space, but the darkness around the characters and the use of sienna tones bring it to the foreground. Cupid kisses his mother on the lips, while Venus takes the arrow away from him. The back of it is pointing towards a small box. There, a small devil is lying down under two theatrical masks, symbolic of appearance. Incest, pedophilia, and a transgender body are the key elements of this enigmatic painting loaded with symbolism. Let's now compare Pontormo's Venus with this one painted by the Renaissance artist Palma il Vecchio. Venus looks at Cupid with a motherly look. There is no pedophilic element here. She takes the weapon of love from her son with parental authority. The landscape is breathing, melting with the sky in harmony. Everything is peacefully balanced. It is clear that the aim here is completely different. One is Renaissance, the other Mannerist. Angelo di Cosimo di Mariano, known as Il Bronzino, was a pupil of Pontormo. The year of the plague, they both left Florence and did not return until 1525. They worked together in several church commissions. And here we will compare Bronzino's portrait to that of Raphael. Raphael portrays his teacher Perugino with much dignity and respect. The man must be in his 50s. His hands are folded in a humble pose, showing a small scroll, probably to indicate that he is a draftsman. The portrait is close to the viewer, but discreetly separated by a wall where the master is leaning. He is austerely dressed. To his right there is an aperture with no frame or glass, maybe a balcony. It is difficult to know if the interior has a particular meaning. It looks like a classical background to me. The landscape is also peaceful and unobtrusive. The man is as real to me as my own father. By comparison, Bronzino's portrait shows a man under 30 standing in a room. He stands casually, what makes us think that it is probably his own home. There is a closed yellow door behind him, as well as a right-angle wall revealing ceiling decorations and a blue frame of fireplace behind. The forefinger of his right arm is used as a bookmark, probably to point out a particular chapter in the book. His left hand is gracefully placed in his waist, with his expressive fingers. Mannerists often painted hands in expressive contortions. He is wearing a ring. There is elaborated furniture around him. Nothing separates him from the viewer. Yet Perugino's gaze is more inviting. In my view, they are both magnificent achievements. Bronzino's portrait has many complicated questions, and Raphael's equal number of straight answers. One is Renaissance, the other Mannerist. There are doubts about the authorship of this painting. Some attributes it to Bronzino and some to Pontormo. No doubt a great example of Mannerist portrait. What I have said about the previous background is true enough here. Bronzino wants the viewer to take in consideration the background. The lady is seated in a particular interior, probably her own home, and she makes it available to the viewer. The hands could be made of porcelain, giving them a strange meaning. Her right hand could even be Picasso's. The lady wears rings, one also in her little finger. She is well dressed, and the strong sense of security in her gaze implies that she probably belongs to a wealthy Florentine family. Here we will compare her to Leonardo Cecilia Gallerani, another powerful lady from Milan. She was the mistress of the influential Ludovico Sforza. Leonardo's painting has no background, giving more importance to the central figure and a different mystery. Like Raphael, he cuts the portrait under the arms. Unlike Bronzino's, both lady and Hermine are looking towards the right and are not interested in the viewer. Everything is ordered. Her features are classical and her eyes have been slightly enlarged to make her lips smaller and more precious. Bronzino paints the face of the dog and that of the lady with a similar stare. She is also admiring a portrait, us. Once again, two great portrayals, but with very different aims. If the brilliant colors, the concern for detail, and the psychological power of the sitters were characteristics of Pontormo, his pupil Bronzino inherited them. He created what is known as the aristocratic portrait alla maniera florentina, or even alla maniera di Bronzino. Again, a portrait of Leonardo to compare with Bronzino's lady. Classical simplicity and discretion, position on a plain background versus a highly psychological presence inside an elaborated interior. In this oil, Saint Sebastian is not feeling any pain. The arrow on his side is not stopping him from smiling to someone. The red cloth is floating in the air, offering several interpretations. The position of his right hand is also indicating something, although we do not know what. Enigmas and contradictions typical of Mannerism. In this portrait, Giovanni Medici is portrayed as Saint John the Baptist. He is shamelessly naked. The position of his arm and leg, together with the contortion of his body, indicate a strange movement. His forefinger is not pointing to heaven, as it is common in the Christian iconography, but towards the darkness of the background. Is he telling us that the Messiah is there? In this oil, Jesus Christ has already risen from his grave and is telling Mary Magdalene not to touch him. The exaggerated contortion of their bodies give a particular drama to the painting. We see a bluish landscape used to create distance, typical of the Renaissance, but the large house placed in the background cancels the effect. The two figures behind Mary Magdalene are also given an important role. They are quite large. Our Renaissance painter here is Fra Bartolomeo, a lesser known painter than our three masters, but nonetheless very representative of the High Renaissance. In his Noli Me Tangere, the open space, the symmetrical composition, and the bluish distant landscape are all there. The sole protagonists are Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and they are fully dressed and holding devotional postures. They are both wearing halos. Everything else, including the distant figures, is secondary. By comparison, Bronzino's Mary Magdalene is showing her round breasts under the bright blue blouse, and the shape of her left leg is also clear under the bright green cloak. She is ready to embrace him. Jesus is almost completely naked. They are not haloed. They belong to the world of mortals. Two different ways of portraying one same story. To finish with Bronzino, let's have a look at this allegory exhibited in the National Gallery here in London. Venus and Cupid are once again the theme of the painting. Unlike Pontormo's, Bronzino's Venuses are feminine and sensual. The whiteness of their skin gives them a feeling of marble sculptures. Pleasure is a bit more pink, perhaps less mythological. The meaning of the remaining characters has varied readings and allows the imagination to make interpretations. Time wants to hide oblivion behind a blue mantle. Jealousy is turning over her grief, while the seed is a sort of sphinx and joy a dove. Everyone can draw their own conclusions. The canvas is again complicated, enigmatic, and mysterious. The composition claustrophobic, pure Mannerism. The erotic pedophilic element is obvious in both paintings, Pontormo's and Bronzino's. After the sack of Rome, Francesco Mazzola, known as Il Parmigianino, settled in Bologna. Fascinated by the advances of science, he invested long time studying alchemy. The occult meanings of his images could have been influenced by his research. In this self-portrait, we see his image reflected on a concave mirror. He knew and admired the work of the German artist Alfred Dürer, the father of Mannerism in Central Europe. He learned the techniques of woodcutting and etching and applied them to his own drawings. As a result of his research, he completed little work in the commissions of the church. He was imprisoned for 2 months for breach of contract. He died very young. Once again, the theme here is Cupid. The proportions of the body are correct and there are no deformations, but the body occupies the entire composition. The construction of his art is more important than the books. The triumph of love over culture, perhaps. The stare of Cupid has a strong psychological power, but is difficult to get readings of its meaning. Where is his mother Venus? What message does Parmigianino want to give us with this image? Two charming angels, placed in between the mythological characters' legs, are fighting. One of them is also looking at the spectator with distant curiosity. I will not say much about Parmigianino's portraits to explain in what way they are Mannerist, as what I have said before also applies here. The freedom of Mannerism allowed for a different way of portraying painting. People were portrayed psychologically as well as physically. The discretion of the Renaissance did not apply. Both the Turkish slave and Antea la Bella were probably courtesans. The cloth they are wearing were typical presents given by their suitors. Accepting them implied exchanging sexual favors. My last portrait is a male, to be compared to Raphael's portrait of Castiglione. The older man allows the viewer to come close. The young man does not. Although he has painted with the simplicity of the Renaissance, his stare is scaring and uninviting. Parmigianino's Virgins are his most popular work. The absent gaze of the child, leaning on the globe, contrasts with the action of offering a rose to his mother. The elongated neck, her lowered eyes, and the fine fragility of the young Virgin are peaceful. In comparison, the elaborate velvet curtains, full of folds, are obtrusive. The nakedness, partly erotic, partly innocent of the baby Jesus, makes him less spiritual. Piero di Cosimo's Virgin, by comparison, is impeccably Renaissance. And to conclude, let's have a look at the Virgin of the long neck. The marble columns are gigantic, exaggerating the elongation of the figures that are even larger. This pictorial device is achieved by placing the small character reading a scroll at the bottom right-hand corner. This elongation of the images, so common in Mannerism, can be seen later in Spanish painter El Greco. The foot of the child gently touches the thigh of the angel, or ephebo, that is holding a jug. The way in which the angel is holding the jug gives the impression that it is not very heavy, yet it has the color of lead. There is a Christ drawn in it. We have already seen this child angel in the Parmigianino's Cupid. Is there a particular meaning here? Mary, with her breast full of milk, is patiently waiting for the baby to wake up. If I have succeeded at all explaining what is Mannerism, you should now be able to enter the mind of the painter and tell me, why is this wonderful painting of the Virgin on the Rocks by Leonardo a Renaissance painting? And why is the Virgin of the long neck by Parmigianino a Mannerist one?